Amelia Hart believed the dinner at the Riverside restaurant would be the last conversation she ever needed to have with a man she despised. She had come to end a deal, not to negotiate one, after discovering that her own company had quietly become a shell for dirty money. She did not know that within the hour, 3 men would corner her in a narrow hallway, rip her phone from her hand, and watch every other guest in the room look away. She did not know that at table number 12, a quiet single father in a worn jacket had been watching the entire evening unfold without saying a single word. When she finally whispered that they were not going to let her leave that building alive, the man at table 12 rose to his feet, slid his chair aside, and the whole room went cold and silent in the same breath. What Amelia would learn before the night ended would change the way she judged every quiet stranger for the rest of her life. So stay until the final word, because the truth waiting at the end of this story is worth every minute. The restaurant sat along the edge of the Chicago River, the kind of place with low lighting, white tablecloths, and a maitre who knew every regular by name. Soft piano drifted from a corner near the bar, and through the tall windows the water caught the city lights in long, trembling streaks, the sort of view meant to make people forget, even briefly, the weight they carried into the room with them. Amelia had chosen it because it was public, because she believed a public place would keep Jackson Cross behaved. Jackson was the investor who had once pulled her company back from the edge of bankruptcy, a man with a calm voice and a colder smile, and for 2 years she had trusted him as a partner. That trust had cracked weeks earlier when her internal auditor flagged a string of transfers, running through accounts that did not belong to anyone she recognized. Amelia had spent 3 sleepless nights confirming what she already feared, that Jackson had been using her company as a curtain to hide money that should never have existed. She had not come to sign anything that evening. She had come to tell him it was over, and to walk away clean before his rot reached any further into what her father had built. At table 12, Mason Reed sat alone with a glass of water and a plate he had barely touched, dressed plainly enough that the staff had nearly seated him near the kitchen instead of the dining room. His daughter Grace was at home with a sitter that night, and the rare hour to himself was the closest thing he allowed himself to indulgence these days, a quiet meal in a quiet corner where nobody expected anything from him at all. He was not there for business. He had simply wanted one quiet dinner after a long day, the kind of ordinary evening a man could disappear into without anyone asking who he used to be. But Mason had spent years training himself to read a room before he ever read a menu, and something about the way Amelia walked in told him she was holding more weight than her posture let on. He noticed the faint tremor in her hand as she gripped a leather folder against her side. He noticed the way she scanned the exits before she scanned the table where Jackson was already waiting. None of it was his business, he told himself, and he went back to his water. Jackson arrived with 3 men trailing behind him like shadows that had learned to wear suits, men named Carter Blake, Hunter Moore, and Connor Hayes. The conversation began politely enough, the kind of practiced warmth men like Jackson used before they needed something. Within minutes the tone shifted, the way a held breath always does right before it breaks. Jackson slid a revised agreement across the table and told Amelia to sign it, warning that if she refused, every financial record her company held would be leaked before sunrise. Amelia did not flinch. She told him she had already sent everything she had found to her lawyer, and that whatever threat he thought he was holding had already lost its edge. Jackson's smile did not move, but his eyes did, flicking toward the 3 men beside him in a signal so small that most people in the room would have missed it entirely. Mason did not miss it. Amelia stood from the table first, gathering her folder, intending to walk straight out the front doors and never look back at that restaurant again. Carter stepped into her path before she reached the hallway, his shoulder angled just enough to block without looking like he was blocking anything at all. Hunter came up behind her, closing the only other way out, while Connor reached forward and pulled her phone from her hand before she even understood what was happening. None of it was loud. None of it drew a single raised voice, because men like these had learned long ago that quiet violence was far more efficient than noise. Carter leaned close and told her that if she screamed, tomorrow's headlines would simply say she had gotten drunk and caused a scene, and that no one in that dining room would correct the story. Amelia glanced past his shoulder toward the other diners, watching heads turn away one after another, as if avoiding eye contact could undo what they were witnessing, the polite indifference of strangers proving far more frightening than the men holding her in place. A waiter took 2 steps toward the hallway before catching Jackson's stare and stopping cold, suddenly very interested in folding napkins instead. Mason rose from his chair, though not yet to intervene, because years of training had taught him that movement without a plan only got people hurt. He calculated the distance to the hallway, the location of the single security camera mounted near the coat check, the 2 exits, and the number of bystanders who might be caught in the middle of whatever happened next. The piano in the corner kept playing, oblivious, and somewhere behind him, silverware clinked against porcelain as if nothing at all were wrong, and that quiet normalcy made the tension in the hallway feel even sharper by comparison. Amelia, cornered and out of options, lifted her eyes and found him standing there, the only person in the room who hadn't looked away. She did not shout for help. She barely moved her lips at all when she said the words that would change everything, telling him quietly that they were not going to let her leave that place. Mason heard every syllable. He set down his napkin, slid his chair aside with a calm that unsettled everyone watching, and started walking toward the hallway as though he were simply heading to the restroom. Carter noticed him first and laughed under his breath, calling him some tired stranger who wanted to play hero in front of a woman he didn't know. Mason said nothing back. He stopped a few feet away, kept his hands visible and loose at his sides, and asked them plainly to return the woman's phone and step away from the exit. Connor, the youngest and most eager to prove himself, lunged forward, shoved Mason out of the way before he could say another word. Mason shifted his weight a single step to the side, caught Connor's wrist mid-motion, and turned it just enough that the younger man dropped to one knee with a small strangled gasp instead of a crash. The whole exchange lasted less than 2 seconds and made almost no sound at all, yet the entire dining room seemed to freeze in place, forks suspended halfway to mouths, conversations cut off mid-sentence. Jackson's voice finally lost its practiced calm as he asked, in a tone gone suddenly sharp and cold, exactly who this man at table 12 thought he was. Mason did not answer the question, not with words anyone could use against him later. He told them simply that he was a man who didn't enjoy watching 3 grown men corner a woman in a hallway and that this could end quietly if they let it. Hunter, never one for patience, slipped a small folding knife from his sleeve and kept it low against his palm where he thought no one would notice. The blade caught a sliver of light from the hallway sconce, just enough of a glint for a trained eye to register before anyone else in the room even understood what was happening. Mason noticed immediately, the way a person notices a held breath in a silent room, and he grabbed a serving tray from a nearby cart to use as both shield and weapon, knocking the blade out of Hunter's grip before it ever got close. The knife clattered against the marble floor and skidded beneath a side table, forgotten the instant it left Hunter's hand. Carter tried a different approach, grabbing Amelia's arm to use her as leverage against the man clearly capable of dismantling his friends one at a time. Mason moved fast enough that the room barely registered it, forcing Carter to release her with a sharp twist that left no permanent damage but made his point unmistakably clear. Amelia stumbled free, breathing hard, still not entirely certain how an ordinary man in a department store jacket had just disarmed 3 trained men without raising his voice once. She pressed her back against the wall for a moment, gathering herself, watching this stranger move through danger with the same calm he had carried while eating his dinner only minutes earlier. Mason did not throw a single unnecessary strike. Every motion he made was measured to disable, never to punish, the kind of restraint that only came from someone who had once been taught the difference mattered a great deal. Jackson, watching his men fail in real time, pulled out his phone and pretended to dial emergency services, though Mason caught the particular sequence of numbers flash briefly on the screen and understood immediately it was not a call for police at all. He told Amelia quietly that they needed to move toward the kitchen exit, away from whatever was coming next. Amelia hesitated, refusing to leave behind the folder of evidence Jackson had already taken from her hands earlier in the conversation. Mason made the decision for both of them, turning back toward Jackson with a steadiness that made the older man take an involuntary step backward for the first time all evening. A restaurant manager finally found the courage to approach, only for Jackson to spin the story instantly, pointing at Mason and claiming he was the one causing the disturbance, a dangerous stranger threatening paying customers. For the first time since the ordeal began, Amelia spoke up loudly enough for the room to hear, telling the manager exactly what she had witnessed and exactly who had started it. Outside, the sound of sirens began rising through the night air, growing closer with every passing second, and for one brief moment relief flickered across Amelia's face. Mason's expression did not soften the same way. Something about the rhythm of those sirens, the timing of them arriving so conveniently right after Jackson's strange phone call, told him this was far from over. Two uniformed figures stepped through the restaurant's front doors. Moments later, badges catching the light just enough to look official to anyone who wasn't trained to look closer. Their movements were too stiff, too rehearsed, the kind of walk men adopted when they had practiced looking like authority rather than earning it through years on the job. Mason was trained to look closer, and what he saw in their posture, their gait, and the slight mismatch in their badge numbers told him immediately these were not real police officers. He pulled Amelia back toward the kitchen without drawing attention, keeping his voice low and even so as not to spark panic. Jackson, sensing victory within reach, ordered the two imposters to detain Mason and recover the folder still clutched in Amelia's arms. Amelia finally understood the full scope of what she was facing, realizing Jackson had planned for every possible outcome of this evening long before she ever walked through the restaurant's doors. Mason used the cramped geometry of the kitchen to his advantage, narrow aisles and steel countertops becoming tools to neutralize the two fake officers one after another without ever needing the open space they wanted. Steam from a pot left boiling on the stove fogged part of the room, and the clatter of dropped pans only added to the disorientation, working entirely in his favor. While Mason fought through the kitchen, Hunter slipped behind them and snatched the small drive containing Amelia's evidence directly from the side pocket of her bag. Amelia felt something close to despair as she realized every piece of proof she had gathered now belonged to the very man she was trying to expose. Mason asked if she had a backup copy anywhere else, and Amelia admitted there was none, that she had trusted nothing inside her own company's systems enough to leave a second trail. He spotted Hunter sprinting toward the parking lot through a service door left ajar, and though every instinct told him to chase, he refused to leave Amelia unprotected in the chaos. He told her firmly to stay near the cameras and the crowd while he handled what came next, and for the first time that night she didn't argue. Jackson used the brief separation to lean toward Amelia and remind her that the man helping her was a stranger, someone who owed her nothing, and would vanish the moment things became too dangerous. A small, unwelcome question began forming in Amelia's mind, one she couldn't quite silence. Why would a man risk his life for someone he had never met before tonight? Mason reached the parking lot in time to see a dark sedan tear out of the lot with Hunter inside, the small drive holding everything Amelia needed now disappearing into the night. He did not chase the car on foot like a man acting purely on instinct. Instead, he memorized the plate, the make, the direction it turned, and a faint crack running along the rear windshield that would help identify it later. Amelia, catching up behind him, found herself startled again by how calm and methodical he remained even now, as though panic simply wasn't a language he spoke fluently. He led her away from the restaurant through an employee corridor, avoiding the cluster of Jackson's remaining men still searching the main floor. Once they reached a quiet alley 2 blocks away, Amelia finally allowed herself to ask the question that had been building since the moment he first stood up from table 12. She wanted to know exactly what kind of man he used to be. Mason gave her only the smallest fragment of truth, telling her he had once worked in a field built around keeping people safe from situations exactly like the one she had just survived, the kind of work that didn't come with a name he was willing to share with a stranger he'd known for less than an hour. Amelia didn't believe such a vague answer for a second, though she also couldn't deny that this same vague man had just saved her life without hesitation. He pulled out his phone and called an old contact named Joseph Grant, a former colleague who now worked as a private investigator out of a small office downtown. The moment Mason read off the plate number, Joseph's tone shifted from casual to serious, recognizing the vehicle as part of a network tied to corporate extortion cases he had been quietly tracking for months. Mason asked him to keep this conversation completely off the record, unwilling to let his name surface anywhere near official channels. Amelia, watching him speak in that careful, guarded way, realized she was looking at a man actively running from something in his own past. She offered to pay him for everything he'd done that night, and Mason refused without a second thought, telling her plainly that money wouldn't solve the kind of problem a man like Jackson represented. He insisted on getting her somewhere safe before anything else, reminding her that surviving the night mattered more than any transaction between them. As they reached the edge of the alley, Amelia's phone buzzed once with a message from an unknown number, the kind of message designed to chase away any comfort the last hour might have offered. It read simply that if she survived until morning, her company would not survive the week. Amelia stared at the screen for a long moment before slipping the phone back into her coat, her jaw set in a way that told Mason she had no intention of running from this fight, no matter how dangerous it had already become. By morning, every major outlet covering the business world carried some version of the same story, one painting Amelia as a reckless executive, caught embezzling funds and assaulting a longtime business partner inside a public restaurant. Anchors repeated the same talking points with practiced concern, the kind of coverage that sounded sympathetic on the surface while quietly destroying a reputation built over a decade in just a few sentences. A heavily edited video circulated showing Mason striking one of Jackson's men while Amelia stood beside him, framed in a way that made her look like a willing accomplice rather than a victim. Her board of directors convened an emergency call before sunrise, demanding she step down temporarily until the so-called scandal could be investigated and contained. Jackson, predictably, appeared in the very next cycle of headlines offering to step into her role personally, presenting himself as the steady hand needed to stabilize a company suddenly thrown into chaos. Amelia understood immediately what this really was. Not a scandal at all, but a carefully engineered takeover dressed up as crisis management. Mason advised her against appearing publicly until they had assembled enough hard evidence to counter the narrative Jackson had already spent the night constructing. Amelia, never one to take orders quietly, pushed back hard, reminding him she had built her career on being the one who gave directions, not the one who followed them. Mason didn't soften his warning, telling her bluntly that she was now fighting a battle on 3 fronts at once, against the legal system, against the press, and against men willing to use real violence to win. The truth of that statement settled over her slowly, and she finally admitted what she had been avoiding all morning, that surviving this would require more than expensive lawyers. It would require someone who understood exactly how a man like Jackson Cross operated from the inside. Mason brought her to Joseph's small, cluttered office above a dry cleaner downtown, the kind of unremarkable space that suited a man who preferred staying invisible. Stacks of folders covered nearly every surface, and a single fan rattled in the corner, doing little against the late summer heat trapped inside the narrow room. Joseph laid out a folder of his own, revealing that Jackson had used nearly identical tactics to dismantle 2 smaller companies years earlier, driving both into bankruptcy through manufactured scandals and quiet intimidation. He explained that in both cases, the targeted owners had been painted as criminals within days, their reputations destroyed long before any court ever had the chance to clear their names. The difference this time, Joseph explained, was the prize at stake, since Amelia's company controlled a financial data platform worth far more than either of those previous targets combined. By the time the meeting ended, Joseph had already traced something far more useful than motive. He had pinpointed the location of the stolen drive, inside a downtown hotel where Jackson was scheduled to meet a buyer that very evening. The 3 of them spent the rest of the afternoon mapping out a plan to retrieve the drive without drawing the kind of attention that would hand Jackson exactly the chaos he wanted. Amelia wanted to walk straight into that hotel and confront him directly, but Mason warned her that doing so would only give Jackson the unstable, headline-ready breakdown he was hoping to provoke. Inside the hotel that night, Jackson met his mysterious buyer in a private conference room on the upper floor, while Mason slipped into the building disguised as part of the maintenance staff, blending into a uniform no one bothered to question. Amelia waited in the lobby, pretending to be a guest expecting her lawyer, quietly studying every face that passed through the doors. The lobby smelled faintly of fresh lilies from an enormous arrangement near the front desk, and somewhere a bellhop's cartwheel squeaked rhythmically across the marble floor, small ordinary sounds that felt strangely out of place given what she knew was happening upstairs. It was there, scanning the crowd, that she spotted one of her own board members crossing the lobby toward the elevators, a man who had sat at her family's table more times than she could count. The sight nearly broke her composure entirely, the betrayal landing harder than anything Jackson himself had done so far. Upstairs, Mason discovered the drive had already been moved out of Hunter's possession and locked inside a small portable safe meant for transport. Just as Mason positioned himself to intercept the safe, Carter rounded a corner in the maintenance hallway and recognized him instantly from the night before. A short, brutal struggle broke out in the narrow technical corridor, ending with Carter incapacitated but costing Mason precious time he didn't have to spare. By the time he reached Libby again, Jackson was already moving toward the exit with the safe secured under one arm, slipping through a side door before Mason could close the distance. Amelia intercepted him near the entrance instead, blocking his path long enough to demand the name of whoever inside her company had sold her out. Jackson only smiled, telling her with maddening calm that the person who betrays you is always the one you trusted the most. As he disappeared into a waiting car, Amelia turned back toward the lobby desk, where a stray document left behind in the confusion caught her eye. There, scrawled across the bottom of a transfer agreement dated years earlier, was her own mother's signature, Elizabeth Hart, attached to a deal Amelia had never known existed. The discovery hit Amelia harder than anything Jackson had thrown at her so far, a betrayal carrying her mother's name instead of a stranger's. She drove straight to her childhood home that night, document in hand, demanding answers before she had even taken off her coat. Elizabeth Hart tried at first to deflect, telling her daughter she didn't understand the sacrifices required to keep a family business alive after losing everything else. Amelia's anger flared instantly, certain in that moment that her own mother had quietly sold out her father's legacy without ever saying a word. Mason stood near the doorway, careful not to involve himself in a family wound that wasn't his touch, though he noticed something in Elizabeth's posture that looked far more like fear than deceit. After several tense minutes, Elizabeth finally broke, revealing that Jackson had threatened to expose a hidden debt the family carried in the years right after Amelia's father died. Her voice shook as she described those months, the calls that came late at night, the fear of watching everything her husband had built collapse into nothing, while her daughter was still grieving and far too young to carry that burden alongside her. She had signed that agreement believing it was the only way to shield her daughter from losing absolutely everything at once. The revelation left Amelia standing in stunned silence, realizing Jackson had been quietly manipulating her family long before she ever sat across from him at that riverside table. Mason offered her almost nothing about his own history that night, only a single quiet admission that he too had once lost faith in someone he trusted completely, after a decision that wasn't his to make went catastrophically wrong. Something shifted in the way Amelia looked at him after that, no longer simply as the stranger who had saved her life, but as someone who understood precisely what oppression felt like from the inside. For a moment, standing in her mother's living room surrounded by all the wreckage of the last 2 days, neither of them needed to say anything else at all, the silence between them carrying more honesty than either had managed all evening. Joseph called less than an hour later with urgent news, reporting that the portable safe was being transported to a private airfield that same night, set to leave the city before dawn. Amelia made her decision standing right there in her mother's living room, refusing to keep running from a fight that had already cost her family too much. She would retrieve that evidence herself, and she would take back the company that bore her father's name, whatever it finally required of her. The private airfield sat on the quiet edge of the city, a scattering of hangars and a single runway lit by sodium lights that turned the night an eerie amber. The air smelled of jet fuel and rain that hadn't quite fallen yet, and somewhere beyond the fence line a dog barked twice before falling silent, the kind of detail Mason noted automatically without even meaning to. Mason laid out a clear plan before they ever left the car, insisting Amelia stay well outside the danger zone, her only role to confirm the safe and call her lawyer once real proof was finally in hand. Amelia, against every instinct she'd built her career on, agreed to trust his expertise this time instead of pushing past it. Mason slipped into the cargo building through an old maintenance corridor, bypassing the hired security and the cameras positioned along the main entrance. Inside, he discovered Jackson's plan ran far deeper than simply selling stolen data, since a second folder revealed he intended to plant falsified evidence directly into Amelia's financial accounts. If that plan succeeded, Amelia wouldn't just lose her company, she would be facing real criminal charges with manufactured proof to back them up, a fate worse than anything the tabloids had already invented about her. Just as Mason secured the safe, Connor reappeared with 2 additional men, surrounding him in a tight space with no easy way out, their footsteps echoing off the corrugated metal walls of the warehouse. Mason used everything the warehouse offered him, cutting overhead lights, knocking over luggage carts to slow their approach, and triggering an automatic door lock that bought him several critical seconds. Outside, Amelia watched the signal on her phone connecting to Mason's tracker flicker and then vanish entirely, and for one terrible moment her breath caught in her throat. Rather than freeze, she turned every skill she'd built running a company toward the only weapon she had left in that moment, dialing her lawyer, alerting a trusted journalist, and sending the airfield's exact coordinates to a federal contact her company had once worked alongside years earlier. Mason finally broke free from the warehouse, bruised and limping slightly but very much alive, the safe still clutched firmly under one arm. Amelia ran to him the instant she saw him emerge, abandoning every careful, composed instinct she usually relied on in front of strangers. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, real fear and real relief both broke across her face at once. Before either of them could catch their breath, Jackson stepped out from behind a parked vehicle, a gun raised steadily in their direction, demanding the safe be handed back immediately. Jackson's voice carried a mocking edge as he told Mason that a man with nothing should have known better than to step into a war between powerful people. Mason answered with nothing but stillness, quietly shifting his body to place Amelia safely behind him without ever breaking eye contact with the gun pointed his way. Jackson, sensing he needed leverage, brought up Mason's past directly, revealing that he had once led a federal witness protection unit during a major operation years earlier, the kind of work most people never heard about because it only succeeded when nobody noticed it at all. Amelia felt the ground shift beneath everything she thought she understood about the man who had been protecting her all night. Jackson explained that his own network had lost millions of dollars years before, thanks to an operation Mason had personally helped dismantle from the inside, an old wound that apparently had never fully healed for a man as proud as he was. Mason had left that life behind after a betrayal within his own ranks left an innocent person seriously hurt, a colleague's failure that still visited him some nights even now, years later, choosing instead a quiet existence built around raising his daughter far from anything resembling that kind of danger. His daughter Grace was mentioned only once. Briefly, the single's reasons had walked away from a world he once mastered completely, refusing ever to let violence near her again. Jackson tried to use that exact vulnerability as a weapon, hoping the mention of a child somewhere safe at home would finally crack Mason's composure. It didn't. Amelia watched, almost in awe, as Mason absorbed the threat without a flicker of the panic Jackson had clearly been counting on. In the distance, headlights began sweeping across the runway as Joseph arrived alongside the federal agents Amelia had alerted earlier that night. Jackson, sensing his window closing fast, lunged forward and grabbed Amelia's arm in a desperate attempt to use her as a final bargaining chip. Mason seized the half-second of distraction that followed, disarming Jackson cleanly before the situation could spiral any further out of control. Amelia kicked the safe well out of Jackson's reach herself, a small but unmistakable act proving she was no longer the cornered woman from that hallway the night before. Within minutes, federal agents swarmed the airfield and placed Jackson in handcuffs, though he kept smiling the entire time, warning them all that somewhere inside Amelia's own company, one final traitor was still waiting to be found. Once the drive was finally decrypted, it confirmed everything Joseph had suspected and more, exposing how thoroughly Jackson had manipulated contracts, extorted smaller businesses, and worked hand in hand with someone deep inside Amelia's own organization. That someone turned out to be Samuel Pierce, a longtime board member who had spent years presenting himself as one of the family's most loyal allies, a man who had attended Amelia's college graduation and stood beside her father's casket at the funeral years before. It was Samuel who had quietly handed over Elizabeth's old signature, giving Jackson exactly the leverage he needed to manufacture the transfer agreement that started this entire collapse. Amelia called an emergency board meeting the moment the evidence was verified, determined to end this in the same room where her authority had nearly been stripped away days earlier. The same long table, the same row of tall windows looking out over the city skyline, only this time she walked in first, before anyone else had even taken their seats. Samuel tried desperately to flip the narrative one final time, accusing Amelia of using Mason as a personal enforcer to cover up wrongdoing of her own. His voice carried the same confident, fatherly tone he had used for years to win over every room he entered, but this time it landed flat against faces that had already seen the evidence. Mason didn't bother arguing the point at all, simply laying out an unbroken chain of evidence instead: restaurant footage, airfield records, financial transfer logs, and a long trail of communication linking Samuel directly to Jackson. He spoke evenly, without theatrics, letting the documents speak louder than any accusation he could have made himself, and one by one the faces around that table shifted from doubt to certainty. Samuel's hands trembled slightly as he reached for a glass of water, the first crack in a composure he had spent decades perfecting in rooms exactly like this one. Amelia rose from her seat with a steadiness that hadn't existed in her voice just a week earlier, announcing Samuel's immediate removal and the transfer of every relevant file to law enforcement. The boardroom fell into a heavy silence as the remaining members realized exactly how completely Amelia had reclaimed control of the situation. Elizabeth, sitting quietly near the back of the room, stood and apologized to her daughter in front of everyone present, finally letting go of a secret she had carried alone for years. Amelia didn't offer forgiveness in that instant, the wound still too fresh to close so easily, but she reached out and took her mother's hand anyway, a small gesture suggesting the damage might eventually begin to heal. Mason slipped quietly out of the boardroom while the others were still absorbing what had just happened, believing his part in all of this had finally reached its natural end. He had done this before, walked away the moment the danger passed, slipping out of strangers' lives as quietly as he had entered them, and it had always felt like the right thing to do until tonight. Amelia noticed him leaving and followed without hesitation, catching up to him in the long, empty hallway outside, her heels echoing against the marble in a way that suddenly felt louder than anything said in that boardroom. She asked him directly why he always seemed to disappear the moment the danger passed and someone no longer needed saving. Mason didn't answer right away, the question clearly landing somewhere deeper than he was used to letting people reach, his jaw tightening slightly as though searching for an honest answer he hadn't allowed himself to consider in a long time. Before he could find the right words, Amelia offered him a position overseeing strategic security for her entire company, and Mason gently turned it down, unwilling to drag the kind of danger he'd spent years escaping back into the quiet life he'd built for his daughter. Several weeks passed before the company's reputation began climbing back to where it had once stood, helped along by federal charges finally moving forward against both Jackson and Samuel. The same outlets that had once printed Jackson's version of events now ran corrections and follow-up pieces, though Amelia had learned by then that a correction rarely traveled as far or as fast as the original lie ever had. A handful of smaller businesses that had quietly suffered under Jackson's same tactics years earlier came forward once the case became public, expanding the investigation far beyond anything Amelia had originally uncovered. She changed the way she ran her company in the aftermath, choosing transparency over control, and slowly unlearning the belief that real power required total isolation from everyone around her. Where she had once kept her door closed and her decisions private, she began holding open meetings, inviting questions she once would have dismissed as distractions from real work. Mason returned to his ordinary rhythm, taking on small, quiet security consulting jobs and steering clear of any attention the case might have brought his way. Amelia eventually found him again, not at a boardroom or a courthouse, but at a small, unremarkable diner with no bodyguards trailing her and no contracts waiting to be signed. She slid into the booth across from him the same way any ordinary person might, ordering coffee instead of sparkling water, and for a moment neither of them spoke at all, simply letting the quiet sit comfortably between them. She didn't come bearing money this time. She came offering something closer to respect, asking him instead to help build a real protection program for whistleblowers and employees who might one day find themselves facing exactly the kind of threats she had survived. Mason listened quietly as she described what she had in mind, a small, dedicated team, real resources, something that didn't exist anywhere in corporate America the way it should. Mason understood almost immediately that this wasn't an invitation back into a world of violence, but a genuine chance to use everything his past had cost him toward protecting people who deserved better. He agreed on one condition, that the program extend its reach to the smaller businesses Jackson had already destroyed long before Amelia ever became his target. Amelia accepted without hesitation. Neither of them rushed toward anything resembling romance in the days that followed, choosing instead something steadier, something built slowly on trust and shared scars rather than sudden declarations. The story circled back, in the end, to the same riverside restaurant where it had all begun. The piano played again that night, the same soft notes drifting over a room full of strangers who had no idea what had once unfolded near the hallway just beyond the bar. Table number 12 was left empty during a fundraising event held that following spring, set aside deliberately in honor of every quiet stranger willing to stand up when no one else would. Amelia stood before the gathered crowd and told them that sometimes the person who saves a company isn't the one sitting in the boardroom at all, but the one who dares to rise from a quiet table when the rest of the room chooses to look away. Mason stood near the back of that room, just as he always had, watching her speak without needing any recognition for himself. He thought, not for the first time, that some of the most important work a person ever did left no trace behind at all, no headline, no statue, Nothing but a life quietly continuing because someone had chosen to stand up at the right moment. Amelia was no longer the cornered woman standing alone in that hallway, and Mason was no longer a man defined solely by everything he had once run from. Outside, the river kept moving past the windows the same way it always had, indifferent to everything that had happened along its banks, carrying the city's lights downstream into the dark. If quiet strangers, second chances, and stories of ordinary people carrying extraordinary pasts are the kind of stories that stay with you, follow along for what comes next, because Mason and Amelia's story is far from finished.